Serge Egelman, and yes, I have 3 jobs. So my research focuses on the interplay of human factors and privacy and security, and with that, my group has been doing a lot of work on mobile privacy and security. So specifically looking at third-party mobile apps in terms of what data they access and where they send it. So in doing this research, we had been working for several years on instrumenting a version of Android so that we could just run apps and see where data goes. And this combines another tool at ICSI, Lumen. I've spoken about this before, but for those who haven't, here's some background. So basically, we download Android apps, we run those apps on our instrumented phones to generate, the data flows, and then we can observe where sensitive personal data was sent, what third-party APIs, and so forth. And that gives us some understanding of how the data is going to be used, such as for advertising, analytics, that sort of thing. So we basically have a whole bunch of phones running, and apps get run on these phones, and we extract data. We automatically look for various types of personal information, such as information about the device owner, such as the email address and phone number associated with the device, location in various different formats, as well as a whole slew of different persistent identifiers. Basically, we have a test bed. We either simulate user interactions using a robot, or what I'm going to show next is a new feature that we've added so that we can actually integrate real users playing with apps for testing purposes. And then all of that goes into a results database, and we post results on individual apps on a website, as well as a bunch of APIs that we've recently built. So you can go, I've talked about this in previous years. We have a public-facing website, search.appcensus.io, where you can search for free public apps that we've already tested. It's a little out of date because we've been working on stuff under the hood for the past year now, which I'm going to show, I guess, for the first time. So behind the scenes, we've built this whole platform where we can go in to test an app online, where we can specify which country we want the app tested in, what hardware to test it on, whether to have a human tester or the robot. And if you have a human tester, what happens now is we have a whole essentially remote desktop system, so that in the web browser you can interact with the app in the window here as if it were on a phone in front of you. When that's all done, we automatically parse the logs and generate these reports of behaviors that we observed, such as where we saw the app connecting to, where those servers are located, what types of identifiers were transmitted, and so forth. The SDKs identified, permissions used, all sorts of that. All sorts of information like that gets automatically generated. So what we've been using this for over the past year is doing stuff to look at various deceptive practices that we found in the ecosystem. So to give an example, exactly 1 year ago, we had just published this paper, which I believe I talked about at the last research exchange, where we were looking at covert channels that were being used to exfiltrate user data outside of the permission system. So the way this worked is, there are side channels where you have a security mechanism that, prevents the app from accessing certain data, such as the permission system here prevents apps from accessing GPS data or, contact lists without the requisite permissions. But apps can, bypass that if the data is available, somewhere else on the phone that's not protected by the permission system. And that's called a side channel. The other thing we looked at was covert channels, where you can basically, do the same thing, where you can circumvent the permission system if 2 apps are colluding with each other, one app that has access and one that doesn't. And so we built a whole system to automatically detect these types of violations by automatically testing apps from our corpus, examining what types of personal information was sent out, and then subtracting the apps that were actually allowed to access that sensitive information, which left us with the apps that were basically cheating by getting the same data without the requisite permissions. And so this allows us to essentially ask these questions like what apps are accessing data without location permissions, and then which are the apps that are transmitting location data. And so in theory this should be null, but we found over 1,000 apps. And since then we've been focused on SDKs because most of the types of privacy violations that we're observing through all of these studies have to do with third-party SDKs that developers, bundle with their apps. And, just because there's a third-party SDK, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that's a well-accepted principle of software engineering, code reuse. Third-party SDKs, provide developers with functionality and save them time. But the problem with this is the app developers need to do a much better job of making sure that the SDK is configured the right way and is acting the way that they expect it to be acting. Because, more often than not, what happens is the SDK might be collecting data that the developer isn't even aware of, and so the developer might even be making promises in their privacy policy to not collect that data when in fact their app is, just because of this SDK. And so what we've been working on right now is identifying lots of different SDKs in the ecosystem. There have been some research projects on this published at security conferences over the past couple of years, but it's very much an open research problem, and none of the publicly available tools are actually very robust. And so one tool that we've been, we previously used is called LibRadar. This was published at ACM CCS about 4 or 5 years ago. But the problem is it doesn't work very well when symbols are removed. So what this means is when the app is, the code is obfuscated, which is often the case, many of these types of tools just don't work in terms of identifying the SDKs. And that's because the human readable names for various files and folders, which might reveal what the SDK is. So for instance, the presence of a file structure of com/Google/ads is a signature of the Google Ads SDK. But when the code is obfuscated, the meaningful information basically gets removed and replaced with symbols. With symbols that don't reveal that same information. So what we've realized is this is essentially a big data problem. We've been collecting, hundreds of thousands of apps over the past couple of years. Some have SDKs where, that SDK is obfuscated, and other apps, didn't obfuscate their code. And so the same SDK exists in a version that isn't obfuscated. And so what we've been doing is using this to try and create, a ground truth data set. And basically look at features that might be resilient to code obfuscation so that we can train on the labeled data, which is the unobfuscated one, and then use that to recognize those same features that are resilient to obfuscation in the obfuscated version. We've also been augmenting this with dynamic analysis, so looking at the API endpoints that are contacted and use that as another feature set. One of the things that we're gearing up to do right now that we've had, I was in a meeting for right before this, is doing a study to compare our method with the prior research on this. And so that's very much a work in progress. Another thing that we've been looking at is SDK misuse. So 2 years ago, we published a paper using the same infrastructure to show that COPPA violations abound in the ecosystem. So many apps targeted at children are collecting various types of personal information that might be violating the law. And it appears that a majority are doing this. So we found various types of violations, and most of these violations come down to activities by third-party SDKs again, such as using SDKs that say they shouldn't be used in kids' apps, SDKs that transmit data without TLS, and so forth. In response to that research, Google changed their policies. And so one of the things that we've done in the past year is look at what the impact this has actually had. So Google announced new policies where developers are only allowed to use ad SDKs that come from a pre-approved list. Ad SDKs get pre-approved on that list because they offer developers options to opt out of tracking that would otherwise violate COPPA. And so we looked at this, and so over a year later, we re-examined over 6,000 apps that are in the Design for Families program, which is the kids app section of the Play Store. And we found that things have improved. So for instance, the number of apps that collect location information, it was previously almost 5%. It's now close to about 1.5%. And the apps that aren't using TLS, it was 40% in 2018, whereas it's a little, it's about 16% now. So things have improved, but they're still not great. There's this list of certified ad networks that offer developers options to configure the apps for child-directed, those SDKs for child-directed apps. But all of these require the developer to take steps to disable the behavioral targeting by actually using those options. And Google's not actually verifying that developers are actually using the options. They're just asking developers to self-report whether or not they use an SDK that offers those options. And so basically compliance is entirely self-certified here. And so, we found that still there are plenty of kids apps that use outright unapproved ad networks, such as MoPub and Facebook. Others that are on the list, such as COPPA, is present in many kids apps, but we still found, almost 40 apps that are sending data to COPPA and not using the child-directed flag like they should. And so this is a difficult problem because each SDK has its own API, and so identifying whether or not a given SDK is correctly sending the right flags to configure, the data for correct treatment is a difficult problem. And so over the past year, we've been building what we call an SDK intelligence database, essentially looking at all the traffic we've found, enumerating it by the different API endpoints, and essentially, pulling out all the unique key value pairs so that we can examine at a very granular level what type of information gets sent to each endpoint. So an example is, in both, Android and iOS, there's the limit ad tracking feature, and this is a thing that's supposed to be transmitted each time ad networks are contacted, the app developer is supposed to check the value of this and send it. So in iOS, here you can see the last line, what differs when the option is set and when it isn't is that the ad ID is just zeroed out and the app is just unable to access it. Whereas Android, this actually matters more because regardless of this setting, the identifiers are still received. The only difference is there's another flag added at the end to indicate whether do not track, applies here. And so that's why it's incumbent on developers to accurately transmit that value because the identifiers are being sent either way. And so we're looking at this traffic to see who's obeying this and who isn't, what actually changes in terms of privacy of the apps based on these settings, are they working correctly in kids apps and so forth. And then finally, I know I'm a little over, but this is the last slide. Or basically, there's several SDKs we've seen that are detecting when a phone is, jailbroken or rooted. And we've been building a whole taxonomy of all of the methods we've been finding in the wild and are about to embark on a study to examine, now that we know the different methods that apps are using to try and detect when they're being monitored, we're about to start a study to examine what they do differently based on that. And so I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Serge. That was amazing. And I know we are at time here, but I would love to get to this question in the chat, or in the Q&A rather, which I think you should have visibility to. But it says, has your team been asked by the US government to provide any tests on the TikTok and WeChat apps and provide them with information? If not, has your team done so itself?
We have done some work. We have tested the TikTok app for both US and foreign governments, and also a bunch of watchdog groups. I mean, there's nothing that it's doing that other apps aren't. If you're concerned about, the types of stuff that TikTok is doing, there's nothing, that especially egregious that it's doing that other apps aren't. So, yeah, I don't really know what to say there.